Okay, so this just demonstrates that really the rationale for everything I do in terms of teaching you is clearly linked to the mark scheme. And we're going to be looking today at our first theorist in proper detail, a gentleman called Howard Giles. And the first theory is the accommodation theory. So we're going to look at who Howard Giles was, what he contributed, how that contribution, how did he arrive there potentially, how was it received, why did it become significant? So we're going to use those kind of key stems. We're also going to illustrate his model with some examples and beginning to place those examples in context. The beginning to kind of offer alternative interpretations becomes easier as we have other theories to compare him to. But we are always going to be using what we call tentative and open language. So no theorist that we encounter is ever what we call definitive or absolute. We don't want to use the absolute language when we're talking about theory. We want to be tentative. We want to be open. We want to be able to say what's strong in a theory, what are its strengths, but also recognizing that there are areas of weakness and constraint in theoretical work, and how different factors can contribute to language use. So we're saying, okay, Howard Giles is saying it's this, but. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing. Now, as we move forward, you're going to know you don't have a copy of the slides. Now, for me, this is how I would do it in class. I would be asking you to make notes as we go, okay, to kind of begin that process of learning. So I do appreciate you might want to pause it sometime and reduce what's on the screen to a note form. Or it's now yours on YouTube. You can watch it over as many times as you like. And because I'm kind, I might do a printout for you for next week. So who was Howard Giles? Okay, so Howard Giles was working when? In 1971. He was a professor of communication at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And Giles was interested in the relationship between language, context, and identity. Now, all of that information about who he was, when and where he was working really comes under the umbrella of who Howard Giles is. Creates a credible portrait. Okay, this, if we were talking about from an evaluative point of view, Howard Giles has good credentials. Okay, he's got a professorship, he's got an accolade, he's got academic background, a strong academic background. So a lot of that information doesn't have to be remembered word for word, but what we want to be able to do is to say that Howard Giles is a credible theorist. He has a credible contribution to make to our understanding of this topic, partly because that was his job. He was a professor of communication. This was his area of expertise and knowledge. But, there's always buts, evaluation is always looking at the strengths and the weaknesses, but we must recognize as well, though, that date, 1971, gives us pause to think. Because 1971 means his theory is older than I am. I was born in 1978, so that would make 43 for me. So this theory is 50, coming up to 50 years old, maybe 50. It's around, it's an old theory. I'm trying to do maths on the spot. I shouldn't have done it, should I? I shouldn't have exposed myself. But so immediately what we have to ask ourselves is it still relevant today then? Is something that is over 30 years old, over nearly 50 years old, is it still culturally relevant? Does it still have something to say in 2020? So a lot of our theorists actually are coming up to about their 50th birthdays. Yeah, they were all around, sometimes between like the 60s and the 70s into the 80s. So they are at least all over 30 years old. So therefore, are they still relevant? Well, we could immediately bypass too much discussion and say, well, they must be because they're still on the syllabus. So there is something, even though their ideas are 30 years old, that must have resonance, that must have had an impact on modern ideas and understanding because we're still studying them. Okay, so that's the sort of thing we start to do when we begin to evaluate and we begin to contextualize our theorists. So look at the date, 1971, and ask yourself, does it make this theory outdated? Does it make this theory irrelevant? Or is it still got a relevant contribution to make? What are the credentials of Howard Giles? A professor, an academic. Does that make him more credible? Can we trust him? Because he must be an expert in this field. And it just says at the bottom there that he was interested in the relationship between language, context, and identity. So not only was he a professor of communication, but his area of interest, his passion, his focus was in exploring the relationship between language, so how we speak and use words and vocabulary and lexis and semantics and grammar, the relationship between the context in which we're using that language, and how that reflects our identity. So he is our first theorist because he's like Ronseal, he's doing everything we want. Yeah, exactly what it says on the tin that relates to those concepts relating to social groups that we've been looking at. So what did he contribute? Well, he contributed accommodation theory to our understanding. So he came up with a theory, he gave it a name, he called it the accommodation theory. Now, sometimes known as CAT, communication accommodation theory, which examines the underlying motivations and consequences of what happens when speakers adapt. So accommodation theory is the way that speakers adapt their communication styles in social interactions. So he was looking at why, the motivation, what was the desire, what was the drive to adapt your speech, and what are the consequences. So what happens then when people do that? So he used his research and observation to develop his theory. So what did he develop? Accommodation theory. Okay, looking at the motivations and consequences of what happens when speakers adapt their communication styles or how they speak. And he achieved that through research and observation. So sometimes with our theorists, guys, the how is a very short, succinct how, through research and observation. Sometimes the how is quite a weighty or an extended method, an extended experiment that somebody's done. But really for Giles, we just need to know that he achieved this outcome, this understanding through research and observation. Okay? Now, Giles argues, therefore, so the outcome of that study, of that observation, is that people will adapt and adopt language in order to accommodate others. Now, there is a subtle semantic difference here between adapt and adopt. Adaptation and to adapt something means we will change it slightly. So Giles argues that people will slightly change and modify their language, so their vocabulary, their grammar, their phonology, their accent, in order to accommodate others. Now, accommodate means to make room for others. Okay? So people will adapt. Now, adopt is slightly different. Adopt means that sometimes people will take on something new. So adapt is changing what I already do slightly. Adopt means speakers sometimes will take on new vocabulary, new grammar, new accents in order to accommodate others. And he introduces two key concepts, two key terms to unpack this in a little bit more detail. And he gives us the terms divergence and convergence to explain this process of how people might adapt and adopt language. So that's like the headline figures of who he was, what he did, how he did it, and why. So he did it, why? Because he was interested. He believed that this was an area of interest. How did he do it? Through observation and research. What did he give us? He gave us accommodation theory and the idea that people will adapt and adopt language to accommodate others. And he particularly gives us divergence and convergence. So who was doing that? Howard Giles, 1971. Now, guys, just before we move forward, if we're thinking about things like Quizlet cards, we're thinking about reproducing this information maybe in your book right now because it's on the screen and you're following it rather than waiting for the handouts. We can always reduce key ideas. I know probably, so I always do it like a quick call. Who was he? Howard Giles, 1971, professor. What did he give us? Accommodation theory, the adaptation and adoption of language in order to accommodate others. Divergence and convergence are a part of that. How did he do it? Observation and research. Why did he do it? Because he was interested in the relationship between language, context, and identity. Now, I was deliberately doing that fast because that's how our brains need to work sometimes. But all the information is there, but I'm just eliciting and drawing out the key information. Now, if you wrote that down, and however you wrote that down, that's your C grade starting point. The answers to those questions based on this page is your C grade starting point on Howard Giles. Now we're going to move forward and show how we can secure C, take it up to B and to the A. So more detail. More detail is always away from C to B. Okay, I'm not going to lie to you. Often it's about depth Depth takes you from the C to the B. So the depth is looking at these key terms he gives us. Okay, so who was he? Howard Giles, writing in 1971. He's a professor, he's credible, he's an expert, we can trust him. Why is he looking at this area? Because he's interested in the relationship between context, identity, and language. How did he do it? Through research and observation. Well, what did he give us? This. He gave us accommodation theory broken down into these areas. Number one. Okay, so what are the consequences of change and how does change occur? So he said, number one, people will change, they will adapt speech by converging, by showing convergence. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that people will adapt the way they speak in order to move closer to each other. There is a desire and need between the group, the social group, remember 2 or more people is a social group, to decrease social distance. We want to use speech to close the gap. We want to use speech to create a solidarity and bond between ourselves in the social group so we feel united. Okay, however, in certain contexts, the opposite will occur and we will see divergence. Now, divergence is where people will adapt their way they speak, so they will adapt speech to move away from each other. They will want to increase the social gap between themselves and another group or another person. They will potentially want to move away from, so this is the drive for that desire to diverge and move away, a potential stigma, a potential stereotype or association. Now, all of these we're going to illustrate and work on as we go through. So I'm just introducing these concepts to begin with. Now, again, B's become A's by depth, okay? Adding layers of understanding. So convergence, people are adapting the way they speak in order to move closer. Divergence, people are moving away. Okay, but people are a bit more complex. So we can get upward convergence and divergence. We can get downward convergence and divergence. We can get mutual convergence and mutual divergence. So in other words, based on the starting points of speakers, individuals can demonstrate a change in speech that can be directional, that can go in different ways. Okay, and I'm going to illustrate these for you in a minute. And we also have over-accommodation, where speech is adapted or adopted in such a way that it seems artificial, unnatural, and forced. Okay, so let's imagine we are in a discourse, we are in a community of practice, we're in the classroom. Now, I am the teacher. Now, the truth is, I often demonstrate divergence. I will use speech in a way that seems different to you. It will increase a seeming gap between us because I am the expert in the classroom and you guys are the novices. And divergence means that at certain times, I will assert myself as the expert. I will assert myself as the teacher. And there will be a sense of a gap between what I'm saying and what you understand. Sometimes I'll try and impress you. So there might be a deliberate divergence. I will diverge away from you to establish myself as the teacher. However, because it's A-level, and actually the way I teach is relational, I want you to enjoy it, I want you to be a part of the discussion. Sometimes I will use convergence. My language might try and be funny, I might tell you a story. In those moments, I'm trying to adapt the way I speak in order to move closer, to decrease the social distance between us. So it's not so much me, the teacher, you, the student, to create a solidarity and bond between us so that we work together. Okay? Now, so therefore, that might be a downward convergence. Now, over-accommodation might be that time where I get it wrong. And suddenly, am I trying to sound too cool for school? Have I stopped speaking like a knowledgeable expert of many years and impressing you that way? And suddenly, do I sound like I'm trying too hard to be a hip, cool teenager? Heaven forbid I ever do that, because that would be over-accommodation. And in that moment, you might lose all respect for me. And it comes across that I seem too artificial, really unnatural, really forced. We don't want to do that.